Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Native American Studies Center. I'm Chris Judge, your host of Lunch and Learn. I have a bunch of announcements. We have a new exhibit, Blooming into the Light, artwork of Sierra Cawthon, a young Catawba woman, in the Five Points Gallery. That's brand new. Be here until August of 26. We're now doing monthly tours on Saturdays. The next one is tomorrow, and there's still some places available if you'd like to sign up for that. We're also doing a pop-up art markets. The next one is October 18th. We'll have two artists in the center on those days, and you can check with us on who they are. Lancaster Council for the Arts, Lancaster County Council of the Arts is hosting the Humanities Festival, South Carolina Humanities Festival, October 17th and 18th. I'll pass these around so you can have a look at all the different programs. Jennifer Gunter Bingo, who is the head of that organization, will be doing a third place Humanities Happy Hour here on the 17th. Next month, we have Nina Schreiner. She's Associate Director of the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology on the USC campus. Her topic is building from consultation to collaboration in South Carolina archaeology, about our ongoing interactions with Native Americans, about graves and grave items and other archaeological materials that we hold in various institutions. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Kelly Goldberg. She's a clinical associate professor at USC Columbia. Sounds like somebody that teaches in the medical school, but it's not. She's in the Honors College. She also has a foot in the anthropology department. She also runs the Public Heritage Lab at the university, which is a really cool thing. I'm going to read a little bit about this. They're increasing access to cultural heritage materials and making strides toward decolonizing academic gatekeeping of material culture. And what they do is they make digital models of artifacts that are really fragile and things that we normally can't pass around, and then you get to touch them. So you can reach out and touch the past. She is co-director of the Diversifying Archaeological Education Collaborative Group. She's working with historic Black colleges and universities to get those folks involved. We're a discipline of not a lot of minorities and working to get that going. She is a College of Arts and Sciences undergraduate teaching awardee. She got that. She's been nominated for the Garnet Apple, which is one of the university's coveted awards for professors, and I know that she will one day get that. She's not afraid of extreme temperatures, apparently. She's worked in West Africa and she's worked in Iceland and in the African diaspora. And so today, I hope she's going to be talking a little bit or a lot about recent archaeology she's been doing on the Horseshoe, the oldest part of USC Columbia campus. So without further ado, I give you Kelly Goldberg.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for that really warm introduction. It's been nice having the chance to come and visit the Native American Studies Center over the years. And so I'm really honored to have the chance to actually be part of the Lunch and Learn series that I've been attending for years since coming to the University of South Carolina. And as he mentioned, I do have experience working in extreme temperatures, yet I will say the worst place I've ever worked temperature-wise is Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Nothing beats it. So today I'm going to talk, as Chris mentioned, I'm going to talk about recent work we've been doing here at the University of South Carolina, but I'm actually going to start with work I've done in West Africa to think about how we can really contextualize what's happening in the 18th and 19th centuries here in Columbia with what's actually going on a global scale. So before I do that, one of the things I think as a researcher, it's often really easy to get caught up in kind of the excitement of the research and the work. And sometimes we lose touch a little bit with the actual meaning behind what we're finding. Particularly as someone who works in the context of the African diaspora, I often work among populations looking at the histories of people who were enslaved. And so I think it's important to forefront their voices. And so before I even start, I want to pull your attention here to an excerpt from a poem that was written by George Hartporton. It was published in 1829. And when it was published, he was actually enslaved on a plantation in North Carolina. And so he writes, am I sadly cast aside on misfortune's rugged tide? Will the world my pains deride forever? Must I dwell in slaver's night and all pleasure take its flight far beyond my feeble sight forever? And when this transient night life shall end, Oh, may some eternal friend bid me from servitude ascend forever. And so with Mr. Horton's words in mind, I want to go from there into thinking about what his lived experiences were like and how they themselves were manifested as a part of this global context. So what I'm going to talk about today, just to get you all a little bit of outline here with the structure, I'm going to start with some summaries of these different elements of research. So I'll begin with talking about the work that I did in West Africa, and then pivot as we transport ourselves across the Atlantic to look at the work we've been doing at USC and thinking about that as how it represents a site of historical erasure, where we don't have these visual representations of the past included in our modern interpretations. And I'll talk about how we can do that work through aspects of public heritage and community engagement. And I'm going to start by giving a little bit of theoretical background for anyone who's of a literary bent, and then bring this all together at the end. So just for anyone who wants to learn a little bit more about, I won't go into the depths of the theoretical approach here. But before we do archaeological research, it's important to have kind of a theoretical framework that actually informs where our questions are coming from, what it is we're looking at. And so when I did that with these projects, I pulled from a few people who use what's called the direct historical approach. This was actually Anne Stahl is one of the main scholars that championed this work. And what she looked at is how these kind of long-term traditions that are passed on through heritage impact contemporary societies. And so her ideas are that, hey, by working with, using the archaeological record, but also working with contemporary descendants and descendant communities, we can look at these longer-term trajectories of history and how they impact people today. I also pull on theories of entanglement, and those refer to this idea that if you look at a population, you can't consider them as just a static representation of the people you see, especially when we're working in situations like the transatlantic slave trade. We have a lot of interacting cultural groups. And when those groups come together, the cultural interactions are going to be really there's going to be complex components to them. And so entanglement looks at the ways we see different cultural elements merging and how we can see that in the archaeological record. And then finally, you'll see I'm going to talk about at all these sites how the political context, both of today and the past, directly affect how we talk about sites, what we remember and what we don't as societies and as populations. There's this idea, if anyone's ever heard the term palimpsest histories or palimpsest histories, these are the ideas that we can actually, as populations, rewrite histories over and over and over again. So if there was, something catastrophic that happened to a population in the past, then maybe 20 years later, there was another trauma and they're kind of rewriting the oral history of that group. And so what gets passed on in those oral accounts over time can really be changed a lot by all those different historical events. So with that, I'm going to actually get started with the actual archaeological research. Where I first started working, or where I want to first take you on this project, is the work that we conducted in the Rio Pongo, which is in the coastal region of Guinea. It's located in West Africa. You can see it's bordered by Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, and Liberia and Sierra Leone surrounding it. So the particular area within Guinea that I'm looking at is the Rio Pongo Basin. I wonder if I can minimize this just so it's not blocking that for you guys. Okay. So the Rio Pongo Basin the Rio Pongo is a small tidal river, meaning that its tide increases and comes out with the ocean tide. And so what that does is it actually makes it a very difficult place for boats to navigate. And so you can see as the tide goes out every day, it's going to be harder for ships to get into these locations. We've conducted excavations at all four of these sites: Sanyapalia, Gambia, Bangalan, and Farinya. And I do just want to call out, sometimes people get a little bit confused because Gambia is also a country that borders Guinea, but I'm referring, when I say Gambia throughout this presentation, I'm specifically referring to the village of that name here. So one of the things that actually brought me to this region in Guinea is what it doesn't have, not what it does. Throughout the 17th and early part of the 18th century or 18th century, early part of the 19th century, traders, European and American traders across the coast of West Africa really focused their energies on these large-scale trading ports where you see examples of these types of castles. You've got Mina in Ghana, Gore is a big one in Senegal. There's other examples of these large castles along the coast, and it was very easy. This is large. It was easy for them to access. They had large established networks with local chiefs, local polities, and had these really established processes at these locations. Guinea, ironically, does not have that. And so or I guess the ironic part is that it's that same. So the fact that Guinea has those less visible factors is what ends up bringing traders there later on. So these large forts, those were all established in some late 1600s throughout the 1700s. But by 1807 and 1808, England and the US actually ban the export of enslaved Africans from continental Africa. So they say, even though slavery still persists in the US, it's illegal at that point to actually get new enslaved people and transport them across the ocean. So places like tidal rivers, like the ones we have in Guinea, become really alluring for traders who want to continue operating in this system. And so there's this quote from 1822 by a British naval officer, actually, who mentions that their job was to patrol the coast to find slaving ships, to capture them, and then if they were British citizens, bring them to court and try them. And so as these British officers are patrolling the coast, they specifically note that they can't go up this river because of the small depth of water. And so they had to ditch their big British ship, get out and go up the rest of the way in a small boat or a pirogue or a little canoe. And so the way that traders, European and American traders, access these hidden spaces was they really tapped into local social and political networks. So Americans and Europeans would often marry the daughters of chiefs, and it was kind of seen as a mutual exchange. The traders would get access to those cultural networks, and then the chiefs would get both the prestige of having their daughters married, but also substantial income, as they would then reap the profits off of the trades that the Americans and Europeans established. And so we end up with these complex transnational families being formed. Often the children of these families would be sent to England for education. And so you have, again, these really kind of complex cosmopolitan groups emerging in these small rural coastal areas. So in this area, working in the Rio Pongo, my main research questions focused on the first one locally in Guinea, how were these traders so successful? We know that there's a pretty big presence of British patrolling the shore. How do these traders continue to be successful despite that patrol? And we read tons of naval records where they are capturing slaving ships. And then they're seizing all of the capital on the ships, either sometimes destroying the ships, sometimes selling them at auctions. And the captains are facing criminal penalties. So how is it that these traders in Guinea continue to be successful despite that supervision? But then also kind of broadening up, not just in Guinea, but globally, as I mentioned, how do these contemporary politics influence the formation of a group collective memory? So how does the way that political notions are organized today change the way people remember the past or the way it's told in family oral traditions and oral histories? And so back to data from the particular sites, I put underneath the names of each of these towns. Those are the names of the primary traders who operated those sites. One of the things I'll be coming back to, but what I think is particularly of interest here, is that two of the chief operators are women. Mary Faber and Nira Belli are two that I'm going to focus more of my conversations on. But Edward Joseph and John Ormond are our other two leaders, in case you can't see the color there. So the earliest of these was Bangalan. Sorry. Right. So here's just some of the pictures, just a little taster of archaeology that you're about to see come up. I'll talk, I think, a little in more detail about each of these images coming up, though. So our methodology, the way we did our excavations, we started at all of the sites with a guided survey. So we were given tours by local chiefs, local leaders, who actually took us to places of cultural significance. They have, as I mentioned, they have these oral histories present. So they said, oh, you want to know where the Europeans were settled? We'll show you. And so we had those guided histories, and then we followed that up with archaeological survey. So we tried to do metal detection to see if we could determine the boundaries of sites. Metal detection was actually, not fruitful really at all. The problem was we often use metal detection to figure out where are the boundaries of sites, because we could see where do we stop finding metal would indicate maybe that's the edge of the occupation. But because so much of this land has been continuously used for hundreds of years, there was no boundary. It just, because of the farmland has kind of churned up a lot of what was there. We couldn't actually use metal detecting to find extents. So we did some shovel testing surveys, and those helped us locate the central areas that we wanted to excavate. And then we did larger scale excavations at a bunch of the sites. We did kind of really hyper local processing. So one of the things where we weren't getting the same reason that it attracted the traders there, because it's so remote, means that we didn't have access to a lot of the lab spaces and analysis facilities that archaeologists often do. And so anyone who's familiar with, there's a process called flotation where archaeologists kind of sift dirt to get the light things to float up to the top. Well, instead of a nice fancy machine, we took our samples down to the river and we waded into the river and floated them there. We did our measurements and analysis on the porch of the house we were staying in. And because there's no running water available in the village, we didn't want to haul water from the well to do our washing. So we actually went and we washed all our artifacts down at the riverside as well. And so on the one hand, it was a very different archaeological experience for me, but it was a really great learning opportunity and engagement opportunity for local villagers, because we were actually doing archaeology, all aspects of archaeology, literally within the community, instead of just the excavation itself. So back to the traders. The first site that we worked at was the site of Bangalan, which is the earliest occupied. This site is one a European named John Ormond initially had a settlement at a more populated area. So he had a settlement on the Ile de Luce, which is right off the coast of Conakry. And that was one of those larger fort-size settlements. Near the end of the 1700s, he was reading the political tea leaves, and he knew there were murmurs of kind of what the European governments, specifically Britain, were going to do. And so by the end of the 1700s, he decided to move his family into this remote area in the Rio Pongo. And he was the first to set up a slave trading establishment there. He died shortly after that. His son came to power in the early 1800s. And his son, by all accounts, was a horrible person. He was described as violent, belligerent, disliked by villagers and his wives alike. But he was a native resident. So he was a member of a transnational family. So his father was European, and his mother was a local native Ghanaian woman. But he was seen as a native resident. He did go to London for education, and then he eventually committed suicide in 1833, which we don't have time to talk about here, but caused a real kind of power vacuum in the area. And here you can see just a couple of the archaeological features. So one of the things that, it's small, so I'll just read it. The quote in the bottom was another quote from a naval ship that had surveyed the area. And they said, the factory is enclosed with a very high wall, built chiefly with mud at regular intervals. There are round towers, 2 stories high with brass guns in each. There are 33 guns mounted the whole circuit of the walls. So by guns, they're talking about these cannons. So there were 33 observable of these cannons in the area. And what you're seeing here, this is a stone rampart. So this would have been a causeway down to where the tidal river is, so that they could lead up cargoes. Again, it's difficult to have a scale, but this rampart goes about 75 meters down to the water, so 50-ish feet maybe. And this is actually about 7 or 8 rows of stone. So this was a massive architectural feat. If I had a person standing here for scale, this is about 8 feet tall. So at the distance. So again, a massive construction. Ferenia, our next town that we worked at, was this was one of those towns where it was a female trader who ended up being in power for the majority of the time that the factory was running. And just to clarify, when I say factory, that's the term that we use for kind of this slave trading establishment. So this is where there's no actual production going on, but this is where there were structures that were held, where individuals were held before they were loaded onto boats. There were often large storage facilities at these locations for cargo that was being traded in exchange for enslaved individuals. And so Mirabelli ran the factory at Ferenia. She married a South Carolina ship captain. His name was Styles Lightbourne. His family, the Lightbournes, were from Charleston, South Carolina. And so he was active in his family's plantation operations in South Carolina, as well as at this plantation that he ran, or this factory he ran in Guinea as well. What's interesting in this case was that because he was a ship captain, he's often away at sea. So even while he was alive, his wife was doing much of the day-to-day operation direction on site, but then he actually died in 1823 away at sea, and then Mirabelli kind of took over at that point. One of the interesting things about her is in oral histories, there's a lot of local lore that she was a sorceress. She had these magical powers. Part of that seems to be potentially a way to kind of dismiss that a female was in such a powerful position and was able to maintain that powerful position, that we can justify it if she had magical powers. Then it makes more sense that a female would be doing what should otherwise be a man's role. But there's also, I'm not going to read this whole quote. Mirabelli is really interesting in that we see her play with her cultural identity in both the archaeological record, as I'll talk about in a little bit, but also historically. So we have these accounts. She is native. She's the daughter of a Luso-African family, which means they were descended of some Portuguese who had come into the area long ago in the 1300s and 1400s. But so she's native. She's from Guinea, and she marries this South Carolina guy. We know she can actually speak really good English because we have other accounts from missionaries who later come in who talk about how they talk to her in great English, that she's easy to communicate with. But yet when the British ship captains come through, she makes them talk to her through a translator. She doesn't speak English to them, even though we know she's able to. And so she's really kind of playing with this power control by choosing which aspects of her identity she showcases. It kind of lets them know that she's the one who holds the cards here. She sets the tone. And it also talks about her clothes. So she does do, one of the things we see in the archaeological record is we can see a lot of what's mentioned, how she uses physical adornment as a way also of kind of showcasing her identity. She wears a lot of massive, gold ornaments, a lot of kind of local cultural objects, but yet her grandchildren come through, or her children come through in very European styled suits. So again, very much idealizing this kind of cosmopolitan ruling style. Here's just a couple examples of the archaeology we did at Frenia. We dug a large trench into a mound that was actually associated with her daughter. And then on the left, what you're seeing is just kind of when we talk about that oral history component and that the intersection of politics and heritage representation, that is an attempt at a reconstruction of Mirabelli's palace. So in the 1980s or 1970s, one of the wives of Guinea's second president was actually descended from Mirabelli, or believed she was descended from Mirabelli. And so because of that, she was able to get a ton of money that was then funneled into trying to create a site here that people could come visit, showcasing Mirabelli. The problem was that there wasn't any archaeological research done first, so they just kind of created a large building out of cement blocks that likely would have been absolutely nothing like the structure that Mirabelli actually lived in historically. And unfortunately, when they built it, they churned up the ground underneath where they thought her house was. So now there's really no way we can investigate that. But again, that gets into those complexities when you bring in the politics into these cases. And our third site, Sagnapalia, this is where we have our other female leader, Mary Faber, who again is also in a large prominent position in ruling the site. Her husband is Paul Faber. He is an American from Connecticut. And the cool thing, well, not cool, but the interesting thing here about Mary, again, talking about these really complicated, entangled family relationships. Mary Faber is the daughter of a Black Nova Scotian family. And so what that means is her family had been enslaved in the US. They had been liberated by the British after the Revolutionary War and brought to Nova Scotia. Then they went from Nova Scotia back to Sierra Leone. Then she somehow, it's unclear whether it's in Sierra Leone or up in Guinea, she meets this American, marries him, settles in Guinea, and then now is in charge of the port in the slave trade, which her family had escaped and after emancipation. And what's even more interesting is that there's all these, with these 4 villages, there's a lot of kind of local politics that go on and some small scale warfare. And we see that Mary is viewed, she gets the support of the local chiefs as representing the native faction. And she is arguably the least native of anyone there, or recently, having married to an American husband from a family that's not actually from here, but yet she gets that support because she's able to portray herself as native, doing the same stuff as Mirabelli does. She can impact, she can change up what she wears, she can, you know, kind of control how people see her. And so in Sanyapalia, there's actually, again, a strong knowledge of when we talk to local people, they told us all about this. And they even said, oh, Mary Claver, she was the one in charge here. And there were two mounds. One was really small, one was really big. They said, oh, the big mound, that was Mary's. The small one was her husband because he wasn't important. We tested them both archaeologically. We think the small mound was a storage shed and the big mound was a house. But still, it's interesting that that's the way it came down in the oral history. And here you can see just some of the archaeology at Sanya. One thing for anyone who's an archaeologist in the room, one of the strong challenges we had, the image on the left, the structures, some of the structures we were finding at Sanya were actually made out of mud brick. So people were making bricks out of the same mud adjacent to where they put the house. The only reason you can see the outlines there are because we outlined them in trowel. But essentially we're looking for decomposing mud in mud. It's a tricky thing to identify. One of the things that's neat though, if you look in the kind of the top left corner, you see those large 3 rocks. We believe that was a kitchen area right outside of this structure. And so the way that kitchens worked in this area, they would have an open fire underneath. You'd have 3 large rocks, the fire's underneath, and then you could put your pots or your bowls on top of those rocks to have an open flame. And our final site, I'll kind of get through this one quickly because I want to tie this to campus. But at the site of Gambia, this is where Edward Joseph, also written as Yusuf, he was we're not exactly sure what his nationality was. And one of the reasons this is tricky, as I was preparing this talk last night, I don't know if anyone else has ever done this. I had a very unfortunate accidental deep dive into newspapers.com. The next thing I knew, I had spent 3 hours looking through all these like ship accounts. But they talk a lot about ships that they capture off the coast at this time and how they manipulate different, like claiming different nationalities on the ships. And that's another way of resisting the British capture. So rules change over time throughout the 18-teens, 1820s, 1830s. At some points, the British are only allowed to arrest British citizens. So if you're a British citizen, you don't want to be flying a British flag on your ship, because if you're Spanish or if you're French, there's certain political rules where they can't capture your stuff. And so there's relationships between groups. And one of the deep dives I found on this newspaper account, it was an 1845 capture of a ship called the Spitfire. And it's this whole court case is posted in the newspaper, and it's like a transcript of the court case. And so as they're interviewing one of the naval officers, he talks about how, yeah, they were flying a Spanish flag, and one of the naval officers spoke Spanish and and none of the guys on the ship could speak Spanish back to him, yet they had the Spanish flag. So he talks about how they can identify, you know, this manipulation of culture. So anyways, we don't exactly know Edward Joseph, and because his name is spelled differently in different accounts, sometimes it's Joseph, sometimes it's Yusuf or Steve. He could be French, he could be Italian. He's described at one point as British, but we don't know if that's true. What's different about him is he actually never marries into a local family. So he sets up, he still maintains power at the site. And again, here's an image. This is another one of those stone jetties. So this one you can see a little bit closer. Each of these stones is about a foot and a half tall. So it's another really large, robust structure. And the interesting thing, again, when talking about those heritage politics at Gambia, when I talked to local people, they didn't know Edward Joseph. It wasn't until much, much later on, one person did say, oh, do you mean Eusefia? Like they were talking about a place and it was a little bit different, but they didn't know him. They told me when I said, well, oh, who built this jetty? And they said, oh, the Senegalese fishermen did. Well, if you've ever seen Senegalese fishermen, they fish in these very small canoes that you wouldn't, it wouldn't make very much sense to spend the time it would take to build this, to just dock your little kind of 3-person canoe. And so it almost seems as though maybe because he didn't follow the rules, he didn't marry into local families, he didn't build up this large local network, that might be a reason he's not remembered in the oral accounts and his story isn't passed on. And so here's some of again, you can see the pretty large structure, some of the archaeology we did at Gambia. So at all of these sites, we have, I don't even know, I make notes. I don't know where I am anymore in these. But we have found a vast range of material culture that really showcases the access that these creolized families had to a variety of global cultural goods. And so you can see here, people at these sites, they're importing ceramics, they're importing glass, but yet they're also using locally made objects too. And so we've got here some, the right-hand corner here, some locally made ceramics, contrasted with our imported European decorated stuff. We've got some flint now, so that the British and French were using to fire weapons. And then we have, tobacco pipe bowls. This is probably a locally made iron garden implement. This, I will say, the one total aside, has nothing to do with anything. This the bottom. My students that I had in the field, so I was I had 3 interns from a local college that I had out with me. And they got all excited, and I didn't know why, when we found this bottle, you can see what the different here is a V in a circle. And they said, "It's your bottle." I was like, "What are you?" I thought they were joking, like making fun of me that I lose things. And they said, "Oh, it says DKG on it. When you finish your project, you're going to be Dr. Kelly Goldberg." And I was like, "How? What are the odds?" It was right at our site. And so when we look at the artifact summaries, after doing running a bunch of stats on stuff, going back to that, thinking about the way people use identity and control sites, one of the things that struck me as interesting here, the reason I highlighted these are, if you look at which sites have a greater presence of locally produced objects versus which sites have more imported objects, the 2 sites where we see more local, Bangla and Cambia, which were the 2 sites directed by men. The sites where women were in charge seem to have a lower overall incidence of locally produced items, that there's a greater representation of imported goods. And so going back to this notion of, well, how are these women maintaining power in the 1800s when that's a very difficult thing for women, especially women in these cosmopolitan families, to do? That nods a little bit to, are they using and manipulating the way that they highlight how cosmopolitan they are? Look at me, I'm using all of these. I might be a native Ghanaian when my Ghanaian friends are around, but hey, to you Europeans, look at how well I fit into European society. Look at all of these European objects that I embrace. And so bringing all that together, this idea that we see populations in Guinea making these really strategic international alliances, and then they're using those in these organized coalitions. So as I mentioned, there's communication between these different sites, and intentional manipulations of identities to accomplish goals. And then possibly, as I mentioned, that invisibility of Gambia in the oral historical record have to do with that violation of this cultural process of engaging through local marriages and really building out your communities. So I want to move now on to just realized you guys can't see the top here. So on to the second part of my talk, thinking about these global connections and moving across the Atlantic. So we all know that during, starting in the 16th and 17th and 18th, even 19th centuries, millions and millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. And so this gives you an example of just showing what some of those transport routes looked like, where people are going to. We have, if anyone's familiar in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida in the Low Country, you may have heard of Gullah populations. We actually have the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor that stretches across those 4 states. And so these are areas where there were individuals who were, again, forcibly captured and brought over, who are then working on plantations or sites in the Low Country where they're really in these very culturally mixed settings. Guinea is just one location where people were captured and brought over from West Africa. The millions of people who were brought over come from a variety of different locations across West Atlantic, and they represent a variety of cultural traditions. So in the Low Country, all of those different cultural traditions are merging together. They're also living alongside Europeans. They're also living alongside people of Indigenous or Native American ancestry. And so we see these culturally fluid spaces, but we also see a lot of retention of those African cultural things. And so to jump back here, people they might not be bringing goods with them when they're captured and forced to come over, but they're bringing their knowledge of how to make pottery. They're bringing their language. They're bringing their music traditions. They're bringing their stories. They're bringing knowledge of how to make baskets. And so in these Gullah communities, we see the manifestation of a lot of these cultural things showing up. And I think that's important to talk about because and this was also mostly just to show off our fancy public heritage lab technologies. This is a 3D scan of a collinware pot. So collinware is a type of pottery that is often associated with populations who could be Gullah Geechee or living in these spaces as well. And I'll maybe talk about that in a second. But so to get to the horseshoe, I kind of wanted to cover that transition, thinking about these populations in the South Carolina Lowcountry, because while we did work on USC's campus, for anyone who's not familiar with the Columbia campus, it's right in downtown in the capital. Today it's an urban area, urban air quotes historically. And people have this idea that, oh, there's, in slavery in urban settings was very different than slavery on plantations. That's true, but often people who were enslaved on plantations would later be brought into these urban settings. And so we have migrations of peoples. They could be both coming directly from West Africa. They could be coming from the Caribbean. They could be coming from the South Carolina Lowcountry. And so thinking about all of those cultural backgrounds is important when we think about, well, what's the context of the people who are living here in South Carolina? South Carolina College was originally called that before it was the University of South Carolina. And I've been working there for the last couple of years. Our primary goals here have been to increase our understanding of the lived experiences of people who were enslaved at the university, and also to assess whether or not there's archaeological integrity at the campus. As you can imagine, a campus that's been occupied for over 200 years, there's been a lot of construction and building. And so one of our questions was, are there even archaeological remains still intact, or has everything been destroyed? And then on that note, we really wanted to build collaborative relationships with university facilities to try to conserve what might be left for these studies. So just a little bit of background history. The university's campus was initially established in 1801, but the earliest structures weren't built until 1805. The first one was the Rutledge College, the normal school, and then the first president's house was built. And this is a picture of that first president's house. Throughout, from the time the university was founded until 1865, there were over 100 individuals who were either enslaved directly by the university or by affiliated faculty, or by individuals who were kind of leased out. They might have been owned by someone else, but leased out to the university. There's ongoing research. Dr. Jill Found has done their dissertation on this topic and is actively searching, trying to identify more individuals and learn more about their histories in the historical records. USC, a lot of people don't know this, it was desegregated twice. So at first desegregated in 1873 for a couple of years. The normal school was a really large training facility and had a lot of African-American students that was teaching teachers. And then that just lasted a few years, and then it was resegregated and then desegregated again back in 1963. So this is the bird's eye view of all of Columbia as it was in 1872. If we zoom in a little, oh, my lines are a little off, but those are kind of the bounds of those two main streets. Got a little off, but this top one, again, for anyone who's been in Columbia, this is Elmwood Street up here, and then this is Bay Street. So those were more or less the main boundaries of the city in 1872. This right here is the State House, just to get you situated. And then this over here is USC's campus. So if you zoom in on that, here again, you can see campus and where it's located. This is one of the things that just every time I look at this map kind of gets me is in 1872. So this was the extent of all of campus. This is the first president's house. This is Full Street. If you've ever been to the McKissick Museum, it didn't exist yet. Right on the other side of campus is and forest. Now it's about 8 more miles of city that continues on. And so this is where we're focused on. When you look at campus, what you see here again on that far end, if you look, you'll see there's these small outbuildings on either side. This is a little skewed for the bird's eye view because it's drawn at an angle. These actually would have been a little bit further behind the structure. But that's where we're going to focus on. And so before I talk about the actual space, I wanted to highlight a little bit, again, mostly pulling from Dr. Found's work, some sample survey of a few individuals that they've identified associated or who were enslaved at the university. One of the earliest or the first person who we've been able to identify enslaved by the university is just a man named Jack. He was brought to Carolina College in 1811. And he worked in the chemistry department, and it's really interesting. Jill has found these fascinating letters that go back and forth, talking about the chemistry professor explains how Jack is amazing, that we can never get rid of him. He's so great at chemistry, like everything he does, he knows exactly what I want. He prepares the test tubes right. He does all this stuff. And then a few years later, there's a letter from one of the members of the board of directors who talks about how unruly Jack is and he's horrible and he thinks he should be entitled to all these things and we have to put him in his place. And so seeing that it almost seems again as though Jack is too good at what he does for someone who's enslaved. And then the other two who are a little more relevant specifically to our sites, Titus Pinkney, he was enslaved by Maximilian Laborde, so who was another professor at the university in 1842. And Laborde, well, he, technically or legally owned Titus, he leased him out to the university. And we don't have any documentary records that talk about what he did there at the university, but we do know that in 1865, after emancipation, he was a renowned baker in Columbia. And so that is suggestive that he may have been working in the kitchens if he has significant baking skills at emancipation. And then the third person that I want to highlight is known as Betsy. Betsy was purchased by Francis Lieber in 1836. And what's really interesting about Betsy is she was purchased by Francis Lieber because she asked him to. So he was purchasing her daughter, or he was going to purchase her daughter. And then she was going to be sent away and she kind of went to him. And again, Jill just found all these letters that he talks about. She petitioned him and made a case for here's all my skill sets. Here's why you should purchase me to keep me together with my daughter. And so he does that. And it sounds really nice. And then later on, it's not so nice. But so thinking about these three individuals, again, to be clear, there were at least over 100 individuals who were enslaved. So in no means do I want this to seem like this is the collective. But you'll see, like in tying it to our archaeological excavation, in looking at historical maps, we've identified 8 locations of interest that we do want to eventually survey. And so the first, we had looked at that 1872 bird's eye map, but then also what you're seeing here is, this was made a few years back by a grad student. And what he did was there's an 1884 Sanborn fire insurance map. So anyone who's familiar, Sanborn maps exist across the country, and they were fire insurance. So at the time in the 1800s, if you have a fire in an urban area, the cities you could have whole blocks would go quickly. And so they had these very detailed maps of all of the structures that existed. And what we did was we looked at all of the places. You can't see it from your viewpoint, but after the talk, I've got a map you can look up close over here. There's like where we have numbers 1, 2, and under these red circles, there's faint gray outlines. Those are locations where there were structures drawn in on the Sanborn map that don't exist today. And so those are the areas that we wanted to identify or to research archaeologically. We conducted 4 seasons of research on campus. 2, I taught spring service learning courses. So in those courses, students were we had a lecture on Monday, and then we were able to get this really nice 5-hour lab chunk on Wednesday. So we were able to actually do our excavations during the regular semester instead of having to do a specific condensed field school. But then I also did teach 2 summer field schools as well in 24 and 25. And so throughout these archaeological excavations, we tried to frequently offer public engagement opportunities. We are right in the middle of campus. So if you haven't been to USC's campus, we were working right here. This is the McKinsey Museum. It's also the visitor center. So any incoming or prospective freshmen who are coming to visit campus, they all go directly to this building and their parents will go to that building. So there were lots of parents asking questions about what students were doing as we were doing these excavations. And then we've also tried to engage in both physical and virtual dissemination. And what I mean by that is we're trying to share out resources, both, take the artifacts places, take copies, but we're trying to create virtual museum spaces as well to share it with people who can't physically come to the site. And so what our work looked like over these 4 seasons, first again, all of the excavation was done as a teaching endeavor, which is a little bit different than the way I structured work in Guinea. And so we taught students non-invasive surveys. So they did things like mapping, metal detection, and ground penetrating radar. You might guess metal detection also not so helpful on a campus that's been occupied 200 years. But they learned how to do it. But the GPR was pretty helpful, and we were able to see underground structures or underground remnants that helped us to direct where to put our excavation units. Here is one of those. This is what that GPR data looks like. And if it might look just like a fuzzy green mess, and that's fine. The thing that is of interest to us here. So again, you're basically seeing slices of what's underground at different depths. This one is at 30 centimeters below the surface. This is at 51 centimeters. This is seeing a lot of 30 centimeters is not that far. And what we found at some excavating was 30 centimeters is mostly kind of churned up fill stuff. And so we think this is the electrical wire. So you can see our utility here. This one though, at 50 centimeters below surface. This was interesting to us because it formed a corner shape. And our hypothesis was, could that be a corner of the foundation? It was right in the area. We ran GPR here because this is where the historic maps showed that buildings should be. And so we thought, oh, look, it's all coming together. The map shows a building, the GPR shows a corner of the foundation. It's perfect, wonderful. And then what we found was it was not a building foundation. That one where the GPR led us to, it was still cool, still historic. What we found was this is actually one of the earliest water mains that was introduced into Columbia. In 1821 is when the city of Columbia brought water to what they identified as the exact word. I think it was like institutions, like fragile institutions or institutions at risk. It included the university, the mental health hospital, and I think a women's shelter were all the places that got water brought piped in by. And so what you're seeing here, this is a large iron pipe, and then it was wrapped in, we think, of an insulating layer of wood, and then coil was wrapped around that. So the wood decomposed, you've got the iron and the coil left behind. And then the corner that they saw was actually this way, and then this cap, so the brick and cement cap that was built on top, probably to that intersection, that juncture. And so I want to wrap up to make sure we save time for questions. But one of the other things we've been doing at the archaeology sites is making sure we incorporate public dissemination. Our hope is that that's going to actually help our secondary goals of increasing relationships with the university and trying to raise awareness of the archaeological resources. But I want to, So in 2025, where we worked this past year, we shifted our focus. That first year, we were trying to find the president's house. The second year, we were focusing specifically on this outbuilding circled here. We believe this outbuilding was a kitchen that was built to support the president's house. And so at this time, you wouldn't have your kitchen in the house because it's open hearth fires. If your kitchen catches on fire, your whole house catches on fire. And so we believe it's likely that the kitchen was constructed in 1807 or right around then when the house itself was. There's no records of when it was demolished. We know that the house was demolished in 1940, so at least by then, if not before. The first year that we did excavations, I think I put on the past slide, we had a lot of local challenges. Our main one was that the university did not want this visible when we weren't actively digging. So every week we would dig our holes, and then at the end of each day, we had to line it with a tarp, put all of the dirt back in the hole. The next week, dig at all the dirt we dug, pull out the tarp, then dig some more. And that, as you can imagine, was a very cumbersome process. And so because of that, we only dug a couple very small units because that slowed us down. The second year, when we're focused on this house, because we had kind of cultivated a little bit of a relationship, the university was more flexible. And so what they did this time was they brought us this giant yellow fencing, and they let us just kind of fence off the area we worked, put up some good signs so people knew what was going on when we weren't there. And we were able to put in some larger trenches, where you can see here from this drone shot, we've got here, and this is the other we expanded. Because they were fruitful locations. And so our primary results, here's just some of our students digging. But one of our goals was, can we locate this kitchen? Can we learn more about the lives of the people who live there? And we think we did that. So if you look at this fancy, swanky, we think these are two edges potentially of a foundation. One of the ways that it looks very weird for you right now, I see that. But if you look at this right here is a mortar plaster, potentially kind of a cap on the foundation. And what you're seeing here, this is a straight line. Just to the left is all a whole bunch of brick rubble. To the right, there was no brick rubble at all. It's in an exact straight line. So our theory is that this was a wall that was pushed over when this structure was knocked down. There is one standing kitchen building that was also served as enslaved housing. That still is standing on campus, and we went and we measured that, and that was exactly 5 meters by 9 meters, and the distance between this big line and this line was exactly 5 meters. So this would track that this would be the width if it was the same size as the other one. So that's some good data we've got there. And then We kind of cut off that picture, so we'll skip it. And we also found some good evidence of a kitchen. So we found a lot of animal bone, processed animal bone, things that we can see butcher marks on. We also found some cooking features. We think we found some heat treated soils that would have been associated with the kitchen hearth. And we found, so to kind of bring this back as I wrap up here, thinking about, my whole goal was to try to contextualize what's going on campus within this global situation in the transatlantic. This is also showcasing our fancy technologies. We found in this kitchen space, again, we did find a lot of butchered animal bone, but we also found a lot of bone that has been repurposed into tools. And we think potentially locally on site. What you're seeing here, and I've got all these in person, so after the talking, you can look at these artifacts. This one at the bottom left, this is the hairbrush that is hand carved out of animal bone, probably out of animal bone. This we think is potentially like a drawer or like a cabinet door handle made out of bone. And then this one, my favorite, is a toothbrush handle carved out of bone. And on the toothbrush handle, we can see butcher marks still carved into it. And so that's one of the things that tells us this is probably locally made. People are making toothbrushes out of bone on a commercial scale and distributing them and selling them. But usually those are really nicely polished and really well made. The fact that this one still has the butcher marks from whoever killed the animal indicates to us that this wasn't something that was professionally done, but could have been done here on site by people living in the space. We were able to help build collaboration. We helped the university find a lot of utilities they didn't know that they had. And so we got to learn how they come and check whether electrical lines are hot or not. We were able to do, as Chris had mentioned earlier, we were able to also involve some students at SC State and Claflin to come and work with us as part of our HBCU spring break training program. We do a lot of lab work, and we were able to do some public engagement projects. One of my, thinking back to that question of, well, how does this site fit in? USC is really what I would call a site of historical erasure, right? We know that enslavement happened at the university. We know the names of people who were enslaved, yet they're not represented in historical records. They're not represented. There's a plaque on campus, but we don't see them on the landscape. And so there's been more efforts lately to do oral history interviews, to reach out to descendant communities. This is Dr. Albert Thompson. To go back to those people I mentioned earlier, he is directly descended from Titus Pinckney. So Titus Pinckney, I believe, was his second great-grandfather. And so as we said, after emancipation, Titus was a renowned baker. We can't say that for sure that he did, but it's not impossible that he could have worked in this kitchen space. And so Dr. Thompson was there the day we pulled that toothbrush up out of the ground, and he got to be the first one to hold it, a toothbrush that may have some connection to his ancestor who was enslaved in this space. And so we're working on building those connections with communities. I don't need to talk about the Public Heritage Lab. So for next steps, we are still engaging in ongoing work. We have sent all of the faunal collection down to a colleague in Florida, and they're hopefully going to be able to tell us what types of animals are being cooked there so we can ask more questions about, in this kitchen, we would expect for people to be, they're cooking meals that are going to be served to the president, served to the students, but there might also be separate meals that are cooked for the people who are enslaved in this house. And so the faunal specialist will be able to tell us what animals are represented in this collection. And then we're going to keep working on our museum exhibits. And so what I wanted to end with is this, when I talk about contextualizing what's going on at USC, what I've done here is juxtaposed two timelines. So we have on the top, the timeline of what's going on with these people that I mentioned, those 3 individuals at USC, and what's going on in Guinea, where people are still actively being captured and enslaved and transported across the And many of the individuals who are enslaved at USC, again, they're not all necessarily born and raised in Columbia. They may have been in Charleston. They may have been born there. They may have been enslaved there. We know Jill Found has located a few individuals who actually escaped USC, go down to Charleston, come back to USC. So if Styles Lightborn, a South Carolinian trader who's married to this Ghanaian woman running this factory, is bringing people there, we have this constant circular motion. So people who are enslaved at USC they're aware of these events. They know what's going on. They're part of this global network, this global community. So when they're doing things like making a toothbrush handle out of cow bone, it's hard to imagine that they're not kind of thinking on these connections, or at least being aware of again, this global cycle of events. And I can end there. The one thing that I am future direction, so we do have more to do on site. But one of the things I'm really interested in taking up, former Chief Wilma Mankiller's call to remember that when she talks about the Trail of Tears, the forced migration of Cherokee, and highlights the fact that although we know, that was horrific for the people, the indigenous populations, Native Americans who were removed, it's important to remember there were enslaved Africans removed with them. And so one thing, if again, contextualizing it within this global landscape, during this time in 1830, we know that the bench detachment is what I'm interested in looking at. They left Fort Payne with 144 enslaved Africans on that journey to Tahlequah. And so that's kind of the next project is where I want to think about as people are continuing to move across these landscapes in this global tradition. So with that, I'm gonna skip all these other things. And thank you all so much for your time, and I would be glad to answer any questions that you have.